Welcome to another show. Today, we're going to look at two different views of what the media calls climate change.
And the greatest arrogance of all, save the planet. What? Are these people kidding me? Save the planet? We don't even know how to take care of ourselves yet.
This is not an attempt to sway you into believing or not believing in a climate crisis, simply to show you different views on the topic. The climate scare tactic of the 1970s was global cooling.
The most vulnerable part of the Earth's ecological system is the atmosphere.
In 1977, the worst winter in a century struck the United States. One desperate night in Buffalo, 8 people froze to death in marooned cars. The brutal Buffalo winter might become common all over the United States. Climate experts believe the next ice age is on its way.
And the television series In Search of, a documentary type of show that was hosted by Star Trek's Leonard Nimoy, did an episode called In Search of a New Ice Age. You can find the complete episode on YouTube, and we'll be showing you clips from this show today. The original air date was May of 1978. I want to stress before we begin, Leonard Nimoy only acted as a host for this show. He didn't necessarily believe the claims that were made by the content therein. Now, 10 years later, in 1988, James Hansen would change the scare tactic from global cooling to global warming. Then Al Gore continued the scare with his An Inconvenient Truth. This In Search of episode begins with Leonard Nimoy describing the winter of 1977.
According to some climatologists, within a lifetime, we might be living in the next ice age. The data shows that average temperatures in the Arctic have fallen dramatically over the last 30 years. The drop has been about 2 degrees centigrade. At that rate, the descent to ice age temperatures could take less than 200 years.
Showing that it was the worst winter in a century, which struck the United States, people were freezing to death in their cars. The climate experts of the day were predicting that a new ice age was on its way. In 2006, Al Gore tried to convince us by his docudrama that global warming was now a thing to be worried about.
If we are unprepared for the next advance, the result could be hunger and death on a scale unprecedented in all of history. During the lifetime of our grandchildren, Arctic cold and perpetual snow could turn most of the inhabitable portions of our planet into a polar desert.
Leonard Nimoy's children are now adults, and we are not living in a polar desert. The leading climatologists of that day told us with confidence that we were headed to another ice age.
Geologists have collected enough sea cores to form a detailed history of climate during the last million years. Dr. James Hayes leads the research.
The climatic record in these deep sea cores tells us that there have been 8 ice ages in the last 700,000 years. It also can predict when ice ages will occur in the future. From this theory, we can say with confidence that we are currently heading toward another ice age.
British professor Hubert Lamb says that a new ice age is creeping over the northern hemisphere.
We saw Walter Cronkite warn us about a coming ice age on the news, which was carried over to this 1970 episode In Search of. Now, just 4 years later, in 1982, the news is now scaring us about global warming.
Concern about rising temperatures on planet Earth heated up a hearing here in Washington today. For years, scientists have theorized about the dangers of the so-called greenhouse effect, the warming of the Earth's atmosphere due to the burning of coal and oil. And in recent months, as David Culhane reports, research has uncovered facts to support that theory.
In Search of presented us with a solution to global cooling in the form of nuclear energy and using soot to melt the ice. Al Gore scared us to think that polar ice could be gone during certain summer months by 2017.
Winters in Dallas and Atlanta would grow cold and icy. Snows would blanket Southern California and northern Florida. Nuclear energy might be used to loosen polar ice caps. Sea ice could be melted by covering it with black soot to increase the absorption of sunlight.
That there is a 75% chance that the entire North Polar ice cap during some of the summer months could be completely ice-free within the next 5 to 7 years.
I'm tired of these self-righteous environmentalists, these white bourgeois liberals who think the only thing wrong with this country is there aren't enough bicycle paths. There is nothing wrong with the planet. The planet is fine. The people are f***ed. Difference.
If Greenland broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida.
James Hansen took the global warming scare that began in 1982 and made it political in 1988. And Al Gore, who was showing interest in the whole thing in 1982, created his whole documentary video and further politicized it. Another climate alarmist, Michael Mann, not the movie director, came up with his ideas and gave us this chart, now known as the famous hockey stick chart. Now, this chart eradicates both the Little Ice Age and the medieval warming period in history. If you look closely, he also shows that the 1930s were colder than the 1970s, which is preposterous. The 1930s were one of the hottest decades of the last 100 years. This decade gave us the Dust Bowl era, where the topsoil became so hot that it loosened, and the slightest wind could cause a dust storm. As we've seen with Leonard Nimoy's show, the 1970s were so cold that they feared another ice age. That despite the fact that carbon emissions increased 1,000-fold between the 30s and the 70s with the rise of the automobile and airline industries. It's interesting to note here that the global cooling scare of the 1970s is also blamed on, you guessed it, man's carbon emissions.
The planet is doing great. Did you ever think about the arithmetic? Planet has been here 4.5 billion years. We've been here, what, 100,000? Maybe 200,000?
If you look at all of the carbon fuels that were burned since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, this is the quantity burned in the last 16 years.
And we've only been engaged in heavy industry for a little over 200 years. 200 years versus 4.5 billion. And we have the conceit to think that somehow we're a threat, that somehow we're going to put in jeopardy this beautiful little blue-green ball that's just floating around the sun. And we think some plastic bags and some aluminum cans are going to make a difference?
In conclusion, we've only scratched the surface on the theories on both sides of the aisle, and we have two very different opinions of how carbon emissions affect the atmosphere. The global cooling scare permeated the 1970s, but as the climate began to warm into the 80s, the scare switched to global warming. Both sides had experts predicting dire consequences due to carbon emissions, but in the opposite direction. It only took 4 short years from 1978 until 1982 for the expert opinion to change. Both sides claimed that carbon emissions were responsible for extreme conditions for the previous 30 years. One said that the previous 30 years were cooling, while the other side said conditions were warming. In my view, George Carlin had it right. The world knows how to take care of itself. I don't believe reducing carbon emissions will save the planet. Also, the experts disagree as to what extent carbon emissions are affecting the climate. The 70s were freezing cold despite the rise of carbon emissions since the incredibly hot decade of the 1930s. I invite you to watch Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth in its entirety, along with Leonard Nimoy's In Search of a New Ice Age and George Carlin's entire skit on the environment. The latter two can be found on YouTube.
Dr. Stephen Schneider is a climatologist from the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Can we do these things? Yes. But will they make things better? I'm not sure. We can't predict with any certainty what's happening to our own climatic future. You could melt the ice caps. What would that do to the coastal cities? The cure could be worse than disease. Would that be better or worse than the risk of an ice age?
The planet will be here for a long, long, long time after we're gone, and it will heal itself.
I also have my own book on the topic, Climate Crisis, Alarmists versus Deniers, writing as Richard Kay, and that goes into more in-depth conversation on what each side thinks with quotes from various experts on both sides. And that book can be found on Amazon or at a library near you. And that was our show for today. What did you think? Do you think carbon emissions are affecting the climate? Are you convinced that we have to reduce carbon emissions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time, This is Kevin Gibbons saying, live long and prosper, may the force be with you, and keep reaching for the stars.